Well, welcome back, everybody, to UK Column Extra. And we are delighted today to have a guest, James Roguski. And we've got half an hour for an interesting discussion and hopefully some questions. James, I'm going to hand over to you straight away. Welcome to the UK Column audience. Tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your concerns to do with this treaty.
Well, I'm trying to be in the background. It's really not so much about me. I've done many things in my 63 years on the planet. And what really happened to me was this particular document right here, back on March 28th of 2022, I discovered that it existed. And it's changed my life. And ever since then, I've been reporting on just the very many boring documents that the WHO puts out there and all of their relatively boring meetings, which are punctuated by little tiny bits of information that I've been trying to shed the light on. And so this all started for me, about 19, 20 months ago when I found this particular document. And this is A75/18, right, from April 12th, 2022. I found a slightly different version of it. And I had done enough research to understand what it was that I was looking at. And it was a document proposed by the Biden administration to amend the international health regulations. And the interesting part in it was actually the last amendment, which is Article 59, which is, what we're probably going to be talking about mostly today. And what the Biden administration was trying to do with that original submission was shorten the time period that any future amendments might be considered and implemented, into legally binding force from 18 months to reject down to 6 months, and from 24 months to implement down to 6 months. Now, 6 months is substantially shorter than 18 or 24. And you have to understand the United States political calendar to realize that if the next round of amendments, which is a separate document completely, if those were to be adopted at the end of May in 2024, that's a whole other story. Hopefully we have time to talk about it. Then 6 months beyond that would have made it so that the Biden administration could have rammed through whatever might be coming in the future. And so this particular document was kicked to the curb. The nations in the WHO back in 2022, long before they met in May of 2022, absolutely rejected Biden's proposal. But what they came up with at the very last minute was a separate proposal that ultimately was adopted. Now, it's a small thing. There's only 5 pages here, and it changes or would amend 5 articles. And so Biden didn't quite get his way. Instead of 6 months and 6 months, the 10 months, the 18 months to reject amendments would be shortened in the future down to 10 months. And so for your audience in the UK, these amendments were adopted at the World Health Assembly on May 27th, 2022. On April 3rd, Tess Lawrie from World Council for Health submitted a petition, a parliamentary petition. It ran for 6 months, got 116,000 signatures, and had been roundly ignored. It was calling for a parliamentary discussion about what's the hurry? Why did the Biden administration want to shorten it down to 6 months? It ended up being 10 months. But, now 17 months and 3 weeks have passed. And I published an article the other day where, very specifically in the UK, it seems like the procedures that your laws require have been ignored, because those amendments, while they're small, it seems like they should have been presented to the UK Parliament for 21 sitting days, in the way it's structured, Parliament does not have to approve or ratify or give their assent to it, but they should be given the opportunity, or should have been given the opportunity, to consider them, discuss them. That's what the petition was asking for, and have a debate and potentially a vote. If they were to vote to reject them, that is supposed to be within their authority to do. But you've had a string of foreign ministers, and what has cropped up recently is yet another document, which is the treaties and memoranda of understanding from the Foreign, Commonwealth, and Development Office. It states very clearly that any treaty or amendments should have been presented at some point over the last 18 months to Parliament for a discussion. But when these were adopted back in May of 2022, Liz Truss was in that office until September 6th, when she got a new position for a period of time. Her replacement was James Cleverly, who held that office until November 13th. And now David Cameron is holding that office. And none of them seems to have done what appears to be their duty, to allow Parliament to have a discussion about this. Well, irony and hypocrisy being what it is, it appears Tess Lawrie has stated that she got a notification that the debate about the amendments that need to be decided upon before December 1st will be held on December 18th. And so the inner workings of government never cease to amaze me. And what I really want to get people to comprehend is this problem started way back in July of 1969. There's a story, I'm sure you've heard it, you might remember where you were at the time, that in July of 1969, 3 American astronauts hopped onto a Saturn V rocket, and they either went to Hollywood or they went to the moon and came back. But while they were doing that, that's when the 22nd World Health Assembly was being held in Boston. And at that World Health Assembly is when the international health regulations were first adopted. And there's a lot of important things in those documents, but what's really important is what's missing. There's no language in the international health regulations that said, okay, we've agreed to this, go back to your nation and properly ratify it according to whatever rules your nation would follow.
And it also happens to be the very same year when the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties was adopted, isn't it? Setting out the framework whereby a member state, this is not accidental.
Probably not.
Very few things are accidental. Yes. And so the same lack or non-information in the 1969 amendment regulations set forth the same process for any future amendments. And what I would like to try to get people to visualize is, if you could just visualize a big round table with 196 delegates around it, 194 members of the WHO, and 2 additional members, Liechtenstein and the Vatican, are party to the international health regulations, which is a separate agreement. So 196 delegates sitting around a table, and it almost, in my mind, looks like a 2-dimensional view of a coronavirus, the way it's drawn. Draw a line out from each delegate to the head of state who appointed that delegate. So you've got 196 heads of state who appoint 196 delegates to go do their bidding at these meetings, and then build a dome over it. And what happened in 1969 is not necessarily that our nations lost their sovereignty, because the head of state still can speak for the nation, but it built a wall between the executive branch of government and the people and the legislative branch that is supposed to represent them.
Extremely well
in
put.
The UK, at least in the UK, there's still a snippet of Well, the executive branch of government, the foreign minister, the health minister, the prime minister, the king, for that matter, don't ask Parliament to give their approval, but they are supposed to give Parliament the opportunity to reject. Now, this all came out because someone in Australia asked me to research the system in Australia, and it is different in Australia. It's most likely different in every nation. In Australia, Canada, New Zealand, other nations of the Commonwealth, the Parliament has zero say. They're not obligated to give Parliament even an opportunity to reject. The decision is made essentially by the Crown through their Governor General, through the Prime Minister and the cabinet ministers. They don't ask Parliament in those nations whether or not they approve of the decision. Parliament will be told to pass legislation to implement the decision that is made by the cabinet and the prime minister. And so
and we had exactly the same.
Is a little bit different.
We were in the European Union. We had exactly the same with transposition of EU law, regulations and directives.
And nations in the EU, have their own unique situation. Here in the United States, I actually kind of wanted to lead with what I'm about to say, so I'll say it now. If you go back to 1969 and you try to find here in the United States, and you can do it in the UK or anywhere else, where was there a public comment period? Where could you possibly find that the Senate here in the United States held discussions about the international health regulations and had a vote or gave their advice and consent? That didn't happen in 1969. Fast forward to 2005, there was a wealth of changes that were put forth and adopted by the World Health Assembly in 2005. Can you find anywhere in the records where the Senate or the UK Parliament or the Australian Parliament or any parliament anywhere on the planet invited public comment and had a debate and gave their advice and consent? Well, they also didn't do the same thing in regards to what was adopted in 2022. Very small batch of amendments, but no debate in the Senate, no debate in Parliament, even though the people asked. In Canada, there was a petition. They got 18,973 signatures in 30 days. The UK got 116,000. Australia got 55,000 in 30 days. And the will of the people was roundly ignored in those nations. And in the UK, the irony of scheduling the debate on the 18th, when the deadline is the 1st, you just can't write this kind of stuff. It's astonishing.
And James, you have actually identified a senior civil servant below these rotating door foreign secretaries who is personally going to be made to carry the buck for this, haven't you? In the blog that Mark mentioned by you in the main news, you found that Sir Philip Barton, permanent Undersecretary, is responsible for laying these matters before Parliament in the name of the Foreign Secretary, and he appears not to have done so.
To the best of my knowledge, I've reached out to Andrew Bridgen. He's said he would ask the library, Commons library. I searched through, Hansard and see if there was any record of anything. Now, what is likely to be said is, these are minor. These are minor, so we didn't bother.
Right.
And
the Finnish president, last time I was on, did exactly that. President Niinistö of Finland openly told Parliament last week, you don't get to say this is technical, but you have already dug out that our 2010 constitutional statute on this says normally technical stuff doesn't go by Parliament unless it amends a treaty, in which case it does.
Ignorance of the law is not supposed to be an excuse. And the point behind my effort to raise this awareness is the vast majority of people have really no idea of the difference between lawful authority and power. And so the law is supposed to define who has the authority and the responsibility that goes with that authority. to do, right? Now, many people have power and they can override authority because, the power of wealth or the power of, military force or whatever seems to trump authority and, what is right or wrong. But in this particular case, the point that I've been trying to make is if you pay attention to how they behave when things are small, okay, and you look at the history with the amendments to the international health regulations, these decisions have been made by I talked about putting a dome over the delegates and the heads of state who appointed them to this essentially leadership council, right? We already live since 1969 in a health dictatorship, not necessarily with Tedros Ghebreyesus or the director general or dictator general of the WHO at the head of it, but each nation's head of state was handed over authority that they're probably not supposed to have. And what I'm really talking about is not a global coup, which, that's in process, but more internally in each nation where we, the people, have lost control of our own executive branch. In the United States, about 3-4 months ago, Javier Becerra, who is the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, was interviewed. And he said, in response to a question very clearly, that he wants all Americans to know that the federal government does not have any lawful authority over health. It's crystal clear. Anybody who reads our Constitution, you just do a word search on it, and you will not find the word health anywhere. The federal government has no authority. But then he went on to say, but we do have a lot of money. And they direct money to Medicare and Medicaid and Obamacare and all these other things. And so people gravitate to it. And if you're basically looking for benefits and the government can print money and offer you those benefits, most people mistake that for actual lawful authority. They get trapped into the situation where they want these benefits from the government. And then if you want a benefit, well, it comes with strings attached and you have to do what they say to get the funding and the services and all that sort of thing. And this awareness is what I'm trying to raise in people around the world. Understand that back in 1969, you began to lose, maybe before that, but certainly then, you began to lose control of your own government. And now, 54 years later, they're proposing amendments, which the real interesting story right now is in the next round of amendments that they have proposed and are negotiating in secret. In the last meeting that they had, October 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th, they clearly stated that they're having difficulty reaching an agreement. And they stated that they are not going to meet their deadline. Article 55 of the International Health Regulation says very clearly, and they had their legal counsel, Stephen Solomon, talk for a good 5 minutes, just reading essentially one sentence, which says that any nation who wants to propose amendments has to do so 4 months in advance of the May Assembly. Well, 4 months in advance of May 27th is January 27th. So we're down to about 8.5 weeks now, and they know that they're not going to meet their deadline. So they spent a good hour talking about how they were just going to ignore that rule. And they published a document at the end of that meeting. And since then, they've scheduled meetings for February and April. And they've said very clearly that they intend to just keep negotiating right up to the last minute, if need be, and ignore the rule, Article 55, that they know exists that says, well, you're supposed to present this 4 months in advance so everybody has a chance to look at it. Yeah. Now, they're going to have another meeting December 7 and 8. We shall see what they make public because they have not made any of it public since the original versions were put out, originally received September 30th of 2022. So they've been secretly negotiating this for a year. I hesitate to talk about the details. We know what they had proposed, and some of the things are ridiculous, but we don't know the status of it right now. And quite frankly, I think it's a mess because the nations are not coming together in any type of an agreement. We shall see what they present next week sometime.
Right, Mark.
If I may,
go ahead.
Yeah, James and I talked about this last night, and it's interesting. In 2005 and 2022, the same basic thing happened. They just scuttled the idea of giving participating nations the required time to review what's going on. And so they just keep negotiating right into that required time frame and just keep pushing everything along nilly-willy. And of course, Biden, in the meantime, is trying to keep all of this on his watch so the next president doesn't get a chance to overturn what's going on in this juggernaut. And so even though the content is a little hard to discern, we can pretty much assume that some of the content is probably pretty disagreeable to a freedom-loving, rational person. And I like, James, how you broke this down between power and authority. Power can just be exercised in a kind of raw, arbitrary manner. The person exercising it may not actually have the authority, which is kind of like permission, to exercise that power. And so the exercise of power without authority is really the textbook definition of tyranny. And that's what we're seeing here.
We have to look at Nancy Pelosi, when she was Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi was famous or infamous for her statement that the role of being Speaker gave her so much power.
Yeah. Can I just add,
exactly?
Can I just add a thing in there? And that is that let's come back to our old friend common purpose, because common purpose in its training of future leaders within the civil service or public authorities here in the UK, but also it was in contact with MPs, David Cameron being one of the lead ones. And what was it talking about? It was talking about acting outside of authority. And so this pernicious charity that buried itself everywhere, training thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the UK, was inviting them to do this very thing, to act outside of their actual authority.
And Brian, do you think that goes up to the king? I ask because the Daily Express, we had to scrap it from the main news, but the Daily Express has got hold of constitutional gold by finding in the midst of a piece which was about, let's bring that on screen because it's your bit, but in the midst of a piece which was largely about how the king was making much less use than his mother of these councillors of state. That's councillors with an S, people who stand in for the king, senior royals, who can sign routine stuff. They let slip that when he was recently travelling to Kenya, he signed Scottish legislation in his own hand, which is something that hasn't gone on since the 1960s again, because there was a Western worldwide, if not fully worldwide, constitutional revolution back in the 60s. And as part of that royal assent, the equivalent of presidential signing of a bill, was sidelined, was given to the Queen's cousins, as they were called back then. Charles is now taking that back to himself, which means, A, he's obeying the Constitution, surprisingly, in some ways more than his mother did. Perhaps he's got more gumption or he's less afraid of advisors. But B, it means he's on the hook personally.
Yeah, well, I do. I personally believe he's on the hook. He's just one of the puppets. And he's a very high status puppet, but he's one of the puppets. And to see his subservience to the World Economic Forum, I think is just incredible. I'd actually we didn't have time in the news to cover it, but I just wanted to remind people of what Prince Charles had been up to. And so I had a couple of slides here from the World Economic Forum. This is going back to 2020. If we might just pop one of these up on screen. I won't do the whole thing, but he's reiterating that we're in the crisis, and he's dedicated much of his life to restoring harmony. Trust me, I'm the man. I can solve your problems. Then he talks about how to secure the future and to prosper. We need to evolve our economic model. Well, who's creating that? That's got to be the globalists and the corporations. It's certainly not Prince Charles, although he does own his, whatever it is, 100,000 hectares of land in this country. But this is the bit that I focused in on. He said, therefore, to move forward, we need nothing short of a paradigm shift, one that inspires action at revolutionary levels and pace. And this, to me, is what's inside this man. He is after revolution to be driven through the World Economic Forum. So yes, he's a king out of control, in my opinion.
If I may add.
Cool. While Mark is talking, perhaps, Brian, to bring up the Estonia slide. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, well,
if I may comment on what was said before, if I said something like that here in the United States, I would be accused of domestic terrorism, calling for a revolution. And so the way this is all structured, a lot of times people will say, well, what can we, the people, do? At this point, for the people in the UK, please realize that it appears that the 21-day period for Parliament to have been given the opportunity to consider these small changes, it's already missed the deadline. It's not possible for that to happen before December 1st. The petition that the people put forth requesting that discussion is scheduled for the 18th, long after the deadline. What you have right now is a front row seat to a soap opera that involves a train wreck. It's a slow motion train wreck. You get to see how your government is ignoring the will of the people, ignoring their responsibility in an issue that's actually relatively small. And I just want to ask this really simple question. What benefit could there possibly be to the people and their health by shortening the time period to consider massive changes that are, secretly being negotiated and may be considered next year? To what benefit to the people is any of these or any of these changes? It certainly seems that they're just trying to set the stage to ram through a lot of changes that, they couldn't even let us have a discussion over changing something from 18 months to 10 months and 24 months to 12 months. Do you really think they're going to give us an opportunity to discuss all of the things that they have in store for us in the future?
Right. And this is going on in EU member states as well, because they, of course, usually
everywhere
have a committee in their national parliaments. And we had this when we were in the EU formally. We still are informally, but we would have a committee in both chambers of parliament that would say, okay, we've looked at this EU legislation and we're okay with this, we'll green card it. We're not okay with this, we're going to have a debate on it, we'll red card it. And as part of that, Dr. Christina Baum of Alternative für Deutschland has written to the health minister at federal level in Germany, Dr. Karl Lauterbach, calling on him to declare to the WHO by the 30th of November, later this week, at the latest, that Germany rejects this shortening of the deadlines. Let's bring Estonia on screen. The expose is reporting this. It has been misreported in other places as Estonia says no to the WHO. It's actually a runaway committee of 11 patriotic MPs in Estonia that has said it's going to say no to the double whammy. The pandemic treaty and the IHR. For both of these, look at James's and Mark's reporting to see the difference, including ukcolumn.org. But here is a summary of what's in the letter. They wrote 8 days before this deadline James been talking about, and they have said that the committee that liaises with the European Union only has 12 people on it, and only 9 of those 12 nodded through back in 2022 that these amendments were fine. So Kalle Grünthal, one of the 11 MPs who's written now to the WHO, says, they're taking upon themselves, I think it's constitutional maximalism, but they're saying we are now Estonia because our government hasn't done its job and our parliament was asleep at the wheel. We, 11 MPs, declare as the Republic that we reject and do not consent to the agreement or the regulations. And there's the letter itself, straight to Dr. Tedros. Based on Article 22 of the Constitution of the WHO, we do not consent to this legislation. So there we are. We'll see where that leads us. But that's just across the bay from Finland, where President Niinistö said, I'm making no bones about it. I'm cutting Parliament out of this.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Now, many of our viewers are saying that poor Mark is not getting an opportunity to come in. So we're going to say we're getting towards the end of the time, Mark, but step forward, speak out. What would you like to say?
Well, I did once. Well, what we're seeing here, I think this is the all-encompassing assessment of this, is the people that call themselves government are actually practicing non-government when you don't have the authority to exercise power, and you're talking about revolutionary measures to really nudge things along, like Prince Charles was saying. He also said the only obstacle is our willingness or unwillingness to act. That's not what government even is. The very idea of government is based on people being delegated limited, carefully defined authority to carry out limited duties for the good of all. So this is non-government. This is the breakdown of government. This is literal civic breakdown, manifesting itself with the IHR, but all across the whole governmental structure. So the real revolutionaries are those that are accusing others of being revolutionaries, and the globalists accusing everyone else of engaging in skullduggery when they are the unrivaled champions of it. And I think we need to finalize today's show with this blatant, blunt, but candid, true statement that this is not government at all. This is the antithesis of it.
Mark, I'm going to agree with you on that, but I'm going to say, for me, it's not breakdown in the first instance because it's calculated breakdown. And that means it's the usurping of proper governmental powers and checks and balances, responsibility, accountability. But the whole thing is orchestrated, even though...
To say breakdown, it sounds passive, like it's happening randomly. It's being broken down, which is an active thing. Yes. Thank you.
Now, we're just about out of time, but James, is there anything you'd like to, just finish on? One of the things I'd like to ask you is what would you say to people? What would you like our viewers to be doing to help you or to try and address this situation?
Well, you may think that I have lost my mind, but every time I give an interview, I give my phone number, and I'm in the United States, I'm in California. If you have questions, reach out to me. My phone number is 310-619-3055. You can use Signal or Telegram or WhatsApp or text me or call me. I'll call you. We'll get in touch. I understand that this is confusing. What we need to do first is understand, comprehend what's really going on. Happy to help anybody, if they have any questions. Then spread the word, share this video with everybody you possibly can so other people know what's going on. And then do your duty as part of, your society and government, and tell your members of parliament that you are not happy. Tell them what you want, because if they then fail to properly represent you, then that's their fault. But if you fail to tell them what it is you want, then that's your fault. So don't be at fault. Learn, share the information, and speak up, because they view silence as consent. And I'm pretty sure none of your listeners are going to remain silent.
James.
Go ahead,
James,
Mark.
make sure you, since it's an international audience, give your email too. Your website is jamesroguski.substack.com. Very informative. What's your email?
It's james.roguski@gmail.com. But quite frankly, it's easier to take the phone calls, because this requires an awareness that you can't get texting back and forth and all that. So I welcome the phone calls. You can do communication on these apps quite easily. Give me a phone call, 310-619-3055.
And you need to add a 00 to that, or a +1 if you're using a texting app.
Correct.
Okay, James, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us. Really interesting. And you've given the prompts there for people to do something, even if it's small. Challenge the MP. Send that email to your MP, make that call. And I'll just say, I called you yesterday and you did answer the phone, and we set this whole thing up. So very big thank you from me and the UK column. I think we've got to end it there, but I see a couple of people saying we should make this particular extra public, and I think that'd be a good thing to do if we can. But James, thank you very much for your work, and for the UK column audience, please go and have a look at James's Substack and call him if you're minded to. So we'll say thanks
Thank you
very
so much for the opportunity. I really do appreciate it.
Okay, brilliant.
Good seeing you, James. See you later.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Alex. And I'll just say to the UK column audience, things are getting tougher. It's obvious to see there's a lot of angst out there in the community. And if you value us, I believe that in the fairly near future, we are going to have to say to you, you've really got to stand up and support us. And we need to increase our support base if we're to expand, cover the material that you want us to, but also to have the strength to stand up against the attacks that are going to come in. So it doesn't just end with the fact we're in a shiny new studio. We need the strength in a number of areas to do what we're doing and to do it better. So over to you, and see if you can draw in some more subscribers for us. Thanks for joining us. We'll say bye-bye.